I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house and welcome to the last movie in the sequence of dark Disney films that we've been talking about. We're going to end with Return to Oz, a film that I actually saw at the cinema and I'm extremely fond of, even though it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and a rewatch has done nothing to dampen that enthusiasm. In fact, it's lit a fire underneath it once again. First off, I feel I need to defend, rightly or wrongly, need to defend the very existence of this movie against harumphirs who might say, how dare you make a sequel to The Wizard of Oz, which is quite rightly hailed, quite rightly beloved, and a jewel in the crown of classic Hollywood. First of all, Frank L. Baum wrote, I think, about 14 Oz books. And secondly, I think it was over 45 years after The Wizard of Oz that Disney even attempted this sequel. So, you know, lots of water under the bridge, lots of original source material to continue to adapt from the original creator. And honestly, The Wizard of Oz and Return to Oz are like oranges and apples. It's maybe a spiritual sequel rather than a direct sequel to the beloved Judy Garland movie. There's no singing, there's no dancing. It's not as light and airy. It has real peril, real threat for a children's film. Remember when kids' films didn't patronize kids and allowed them to be scared? And anyway, I don't see it to be too much of a tonal shift. Because speaking personally, The Wicked Witch of the West was the first movie villain as a small child that absolutely terrified me. And I'll be honest, she terrifies me to this day. She got under my skin and put a shiver in my soul that just sits there and vibrates every time I see her on the screen. There are children out there who like to be scared. There are children out there who like their fairy tales and their fantasy stories to give real peril, real threat. Villains and monsters that are scary and who could kill our young hero protagonists. And Return to Oz gives us that in spades. Oh boy, does it. We're told very early on that this film is set 6 months after Dorothy's first visit to Oz, and Auntie Em is still worried that Dorothy is clinging on to these clearly imaginary stories of this magical land that she visited, and she's worried for Dorothy's mental health. And her answer in the world of Return to Oz is to take her to the big city and let her stay overnight with a preeminent doctor who is specialising in newfangled electricity as a therapy for psychological conditions. That's right. Dorothy, at the start of this movie, is going to be given electroshock therapy. This is not your mum and dad's Wizard of Oz. This is 80s Wizard of Oz, okay? And while I'm not going to lean in and suggest in any way that Return to Oz is a horror movie, the section in the hospital, starting with Dorothy in her cell and the thunderstorm out at night, and then the nurse and the orderlies coming to get her, strapping her into her gurney, wheeling her down the corridor with all these flickering lights going on, wheeling her up to the electroshock machine, putting those contacts on her forehead and taking her right up to the moment where her brain is about to be fried. All of that is shot and framed. And even her escape afterwards in the shadows with the nurse chasing her with a torch. All of that is framed absolutely as a horror movie. And when in short order Dorothy returns to Oz, this is not the Oz she left behind that we know and love. The yellow brick road is smashed to pieces. The Emerald City is in absolute ruins. The Scarecrow King is missing and all of her friends from her previous adventure have been turned to stone. This is the kids' film equivalent of the transition from James Cameron's Aliens to David Fincher's Alien 3. Everything you love is dead and gone. Now, let's get on with surviving this shit show. And survive she has to. Poor young Dorothy has to deal with the passing of everything she knew and loved in a fantasy world, knowing back home in the real world that the only people she can depend on and love don't believe her when she tells the truth and actually want to jam electricity through her brain for simply speaking about her experiences. Fraser Bulk plays the young Dorothy. Clearly the character's been de-aged from the Judy Garland era Dorothy, and now I've never read Frank L. Baum's books. If you have, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but my gut tells me, I suspect that Dorothy's more age appropriate in Return to Oz than she was in The Wizard of Oz. And I actually suspect that the feel and the tone of Return to Oz is more akin to Baum's books. Once she escapes to Oz, her troubles have really only just started. The forces aligned against her in her efforts to find out what happened to the Emerald City and reverse it and save her friends are wider and more varied than the Wicked Witch of the West. And it begins with the Wheelers, whose limbs end in wheels rather than hands and feet, these long-limbed strange creatures whose squeaking wheels echo the squeaking wheels of the gurney that she was strapped to back at the sanitarium. Because where it's alluded to at the end of Wizard of Oz, Return to Oz has no problem leaning hard into the notion that everything that happens in Oz is happening in Dorothy's mind, and that leaves the particularly sour taste that might mean that perhaps in the real world maybe she is slightly mentally unwell. I like to think that she's just blessed with an abundance of imagination, and her aunt and uncle are a little too parochial and small-minded to be able to deal with that. But we are kicking off with a story that is about a little young lady, a young girl who has an overabundance of imagination, and that's not the done thing for young women to have. So what we'll do is we'll zap you with science and zap you into compliance. The Wheelers, it turns out, are the enforcers for Queen Mombi, who is the first big villain of the piece. When we get to Mombi's castle and are introduced to her and her magnificent surroundings and wonderful costumes in a film where we see a young girl take items and people from her real world and populate her fantasy world with them, suddenly you will start to see connections with Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth and Tarsem Singh's masterly film The Fall. Return to Oz is clearly the godmother of these two adult fantasy films, and the glorious thing about Return to Oz is it is a kids film. It just doesn't pander to the kids. So sure, why not? Mombi's got a collection of heads that she keeps in glass cases in an ornate corridor, and she'll switch her heads at whim and quite fancies the look of Dorothy's head, but she's not quite old enough yet, so she's going to lock her up in the tower until her head has matured to the point where she can lop it off like a ripe cantaloupe and have another head for her collection. I mean, sure, why not? Just another little bit of seasoning of nightmare fuel on this children's story. And then when Dorothy gets locked up in the tower, she comes across Peter Pumpkinhead, no less nightmarish for being one of her allies. And then they make this contraption with a Gump's head, and this magical powder that brought Peter to life also brings this creature to life. And we're entertained to a tiny section in the movie that sort of goes into an existential debate about the meaning of being and how Peter is alive, and this thing that they've created starts asking philosophical questions like, what am I? And Dorothy says, well, you're just a thing. Everything's taking us to a showdown with the final and main villain, the Nome King, a sort of rock titan, I guess, that exists beneath the mountains where the emeralds for the Emerald City were mined, and he has reclaimed them. They're mine and I'm taking them back. They were stolen from me. And while some people might think that the claymation that goes into the animation of the Nome King's rock army and the Nome King himself look a little bit lo-fi, I actually think that sort of lo-fi claymation aspect of it makes it kind of timeless and strangely creepy. There's something actually physically there going on that has more of a personality than anything CG, no matter how expensive and how slick, would ever give you. And the Nome King himself becoming more and more human with each soul or person he takes and adds to his collection is just uncanny enough and creepy enough to just sit there in the back of your head. And like Mombi, every once in a while, if you remember this mainly forgotten movie, you think, oh yeah, the Nome King. Oh yeah, Mombi. It's not a perfect film by any stretch of the imagination. I personally believe more the connections and friendships that are built up over the course of The Wizard of Oz, so that when the Scarecrow is attacked by the winged monkeys and his straw body is strewn all over the place, and when Dorothy at the end of that movie bids her tearful goodbyes to her friends and companions, I believe the wrench of those relationships much more than I do in Return to Oz. I think it's because, one, in Wizard of Oz, they all have songs together, and Judy Garland and all of the characters are much more effusive. In Return to Oz, young Dorothy is a lot more stoic and businesslike. Right, well, we have to get on with this. She's gone through the wonder of Oz phase, and now it's, well, right, we need to knuckle down and get on with sorting this out. She's also surrounded by these strange existential characters. Peter Pumpkinhead, who's alive, but what am I? He's a sort of Pinocchio. He doesn't really want to be a real boy, but he's not a person. He is a thing. And we have TikTok, who is probably the most human of all of them, and yet is very explicitly not a person. He is just another animated thing, an automaton. So we've moved from the kind of twee lessons of, oh, if I only had a heart, well, you had a heart all along. If I only had courage, you had courage all along, to much more sort of Cartesian questions, this sort of philosophical, foggy netherworld where you don't really want to prod too hard at some of the questions being asked, because the answers are really scary. I don't think it ever pushes so hard into the horror that it becomes too much for kids. It's not overtly violent, it's not overtly bloody, but there are enough nightmare images in there to give young kids who don't want to be talked down to a decent thrill, a decent scare, all in a story that also doesn't talk down to them and is a pretty damn good rollicking fantasy adventure that will fire anyone's imagination. It is a pity that Return to Oz, just like pretty much all of these movies we've talked about for Dark Disney, was upon release a commercial and critical failure that over the decades has come to garner more of a cult following. It's a pity that there's this time that we look back on where new things were tried, the envelope was pushed even just a little bit, darker elements brought in, slightly more sophisticated storytelling from Walt Disney Productions, dare I say, and we look back on that period as a strange little experiment, a strange little bubble that sort of went wrong, and we'll stick to our Lion Kings and Little Mermaids from now on. And it's not just Disney. I don't think kids were as coddled in their kids' films back then as they maybe are today, or I might just be a grumpy old man who's completely out of touch with what kids are doing nowadays. I'm just not sure that a film nowadays would kill the horse like they did in The Never-Ending Story, a pain that I will never get over. but at the same time appreciate that there's these dark little gems. Kids' fantasy stories should be shot through with a little darkness, otherwise where are the stakes? What's the point? Anyway, that's the end for the Dark Disney series. We're going to be going back to full horror, my absolute comfort zone, fantasy fables for adults, full of murder, mayhem, boobs, blood, the usual. I hope you can stick around and join me for that.